SECfans.com. I'm going to talk college football playoffs, Oklahoma and Georgia. We're also going to touch on Alabama and Clemson later on. We're also going to discuss some of the other games, the bowl games, especially the ones that impacted the SEC, but we wanted to get this one out first for y'all so we'd have a whole month to sort of digest it. Oklahoma fans, Georgia fans, you're familiar with our channel. You know the drill. In the comments, give us your score predictions, your MVPs, and any discussions you have with one another. Back it up with data, not just ridiculous language and foul names, which, Miami, we're not covering a Miami game, so I think we're pretty safe on that. All right, so let's talk, Josh. Let's talk about Georgia first. We'll get into Oklahoma in a second. You and I discussed that coming into the Auburn game, we thought that game was going to be a little bit closer, but Georgia winning. Auburn ended up winning. But after the game, both you and I said, look, this game doesn't reflect Auburn or Georgia. Auburn isn't known to blow really good teams out. Georgia isn't known to get blown out. We said going into the SEC championship game that Georgia was probably going to win that game if Kerryon Johnson wasn't 100%. Turns out that's what happened. I think you even said 14 or 17 points for Auburn, something way lower than their original game output, and that's what we got. So, after the Auburn-Georgia game, the first one, everybody was super down on Georgia. Now, after the Auburn-Georgia game in the SEC championship, my question to you is, are we overvaluing Georgia at this point, and maybe we're giving them a little too much hype coming into the playoffs?
It's always a possibility. People tend to view the way that ball games go as kind of a rubber band, and they go one way and they get really high on a team, and it goes until it stretches out. It becomes unrealistic. The team can't meet those unrealistic expectations, and everyone sort of panics, and they reverse the other way, and they think their team's terrible. And it was kind of funny to us, fans of both for and against Georgia, really freaked out when Georgia lost to Auburn by a really significant margin in the first game, and they overreacted. They felt like Georgia was suddenly a terrible team, that Georgia was completely limited because of Jake Fromm. They couldn't accomplish anything. We had complained all year about the fact that Georgia wasn't really utilizing Jake Fromm as a passer very much, and our biggest complaint was always the fact that you can't put yourself in a situation where the first time you need a quarterback to complete more than 20 passes is in a major game. They hadn't asked that of him since the Notre Dame game. We were seriously concerned because the passing game was very ineffective against Notre Dame in that 1-point win. I think in retrospect, you can look back at that game and know really what we saw at the time, which was that Georgia was a much better team than Notre Dame. We both were really high, and I was extremely high on Georgia coming out of the Notre Dame game because my feeling was Notre Dame was really, really lucky to keep that game to 20-19, and it was a handful of bad plays that hurt them, but it was also just a ton of penalties and inconsistency and a lot of different things. But man-to-man, Georgia just completely, in my opinion, outclassed Notre Dame in that football game. The first Auburn game was the first time really since then that Georgia got legitimately challenged, and they did thump Mississippi State. We've talked about that a little bit. There were a lot of things that kind of made that game what it was and how it went early. And also Mississippi State's defense, really until the very end of the year, was not great. They had a lot of really serious issues. But following that, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, Missouri, Florida, South Carolina, none of those are good teams. And of that group, I think at this point, it's probably clear South Carolina was the best when they played. Missouri did turn around, but turned around late. They were a terrible team early that honestly, I think just didn't care until at some point their coach sparked them and they finally started caring. So they got into that Auburn game and they got punched in the mouth a little bit in Jordan-Hare. They didn't respond well. I felt like Fromm actually executed the offense pretty well as a passer, but they had a lot of drop passes. They had a lot of timing issues and really just unsurprisingly looked like an offense that hadn't tried to execute a balanced attack for most of the season. And they lost. But now I think a lot of people are going to look at how they did in Auburn in a neutral site game, and they're going to think, okay, well, now Fromm's an exceedingly good passer, and they can dominate anybody with a run. That is a bit of an overreaction. And one of the big things is, I think in small part, Georgia didn't completely and utterly dominate in a per play sense against Auburn. And when I say that, I mean they were a little bit more effective than they were against, say, South Carolina. And while that was a pretty strong performance, I think, maybe it was a little bit uncharacteristic, and a lot of it came from the fact that Auburn had some really untimely turnovers, and it became very clear, I think, very quickly that Kerryon Johnson was not 100%, not and without Petway and with Cam Martin coming off a sprained ankle. Auburn had a lot of smoke and mirrors, and they were having to do a lot of risky plays and finesse in their first scoring drive. I think we messaged back and forth on that. They didn't really do anything traditional in that drive. They had to sort of invent ways to move the ball. And once Georgia realized that Auburn didn't have a real run threat, they could just sort of strangle them for the rest of the game. They were able to play conservative, and eventually they wore out Auburn's defense because they were on the field way too much. I think the total sort of perspective on that is I think Georgia is still a little bit limited in the passing game. We had a video where we asked if Jake Fromm was overrated, mainly because one, you liked to put up a title just to sort of poke the bear a little bit, but the main point there was whether the passing game was overrated, and I think that had to do with the receivers. I'm not 100% sold on Georgia's receivers. I think they have some flaws. I think the receiving core probably will struggle a little bit to gain separation against certain teams. I'm not sure if that's going to necessarily be true against Oklahoma. We'll talk about that in a bit. But as a team, as their performance, was it characteristic? Was it uncharacteristic? Well, we said against Auburn in the conference championship game that Georgia would run for about 4 yards per carry. They'd pass for about 6.5. Georgia ran for almost 6 yards per carry. They passed for 8.5 yards per carry, yards per attempt, rather. So they exceeded our predictions by a significant amount. But I think more notably, Georgia actually managed their season average running and just short of their season average passing. I don't think it's realistic to expect to play a team of Auburn's caliber defensively and play the same way you did against a South Carolina. Normally, you're going to be held to a little bit more in check than that. And I say that because what we're going to get into in a minute, Oklahoma's defense average allows teams right at their opponent averages. And in this discussion, I don't know that you're going to see Georgia necessarily radically increase their scoring production. I think it's more realistic to think that Georgia's production against Auburn was an outlier, and you should expect similar production against Oklahoma, because even though Oklahoma is not as good defensively as Auburn, and they're not, Oklahoma is still solid enough, and Georgia's production against Auburn was uncharacteristic for what Auburn had allowed. And I can say that with confidence because Georgia has seen another game where Auburn held them to dramatically fewer yardage. So they realized that, okay, we played Auburn twice. One time we did terrible, one time we did excellent. Neither one of those was really completely indicative of the team. It should have been somewhere in the middle. And I think all of that context, and I know it's a lot of it, but all of that context is very important to understanding who Georgia is as a football team going into this matchup.
So one of the things you mentioned that I think is interesting, and I think Georgia fans need to be maybe worried about, is you said you expect Georgia to kind of hit what we saw in that Auburn game because those yard per play averages were about their average, and Oklahoma holds teams to about their average, which on its face sounds pretty good if Georgia offensively can get their average. But now's where we talk about Oklahoma and this Oklahoma offense. So at least from a high level, because I want to discuss physicality and Georgia's run game and all of that in a minute, but at least from a high level, based on what you just said and Georgia probably hitting their averages offensively, does that give you a little concern given that Oklahoma is this massively huge juggernaut offensively that you kind of need to play above your head if you want to beat them?
It has to give you at least some level of concern. Anytime you face a dominant offense, an offense that can pretty much without fail put up a large number of points, it puts a tremendous amount of stress on your team. And I think one of the defining things in that first Auburn game was that Auburn put pressure on Georgia to continue to move the ball and to continue to score, and they didn't respond well. And in this second game, without a healthy Kerryon Johnson, they weren't able to put that pressure on Georgia. And that's how Georgia, again, got going with a running game and really took over the game. Oklahoma has one of the better offenses that we've seen really in quite a while. And, it's interesting to me when you look at Oklahoma and what they're able to accomplish, that they've been able to score points pretty well consistently despite who they're playing or where they're at. Their lowest yardage point total of the season was 29 points, I believe, against Texas. Yeah. And they scored 31 on Ohio State. They scored 41 on Kansas. They scored 38 on TCU. 62 when they needed to against Oklahoma State. But by and large, you could depend on Oklahoma to score 30 plus on just about anyone. And a lot of SEC fans are going to kind of scoff and say, well, this is Big 12 football, Big 12 defenses. First, I kind of want to note that there is probably a little bit of merit to the fact that Big 12 defenses aren't fantastic. That shouldn't be totally thrown aside by Big 12 fans. On the other hand, that Ohio State data point is very telling. Oklahoma moved the ball for 6.81 yards per play against Ohio State in that game. That was a really impressive number. And if you look at what Ohio State allowed in the remainder of their games, really the only other time that they were even close to that was in that Iowa game where they got blown out by 55 points. And Iowa averaged just a tenth of a yard per play more than Oklahoma did. In fact, that's kind of why in that Ohio State Oklahoma game, it may not have been that many points, but they were really, in a per play sense, about as dominant as Iowa was. It just didn't generate nearly quite as much production, in part because they were a little more deliberate and a little less explosive. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But, when we looked at, our predictions, right? How accurate were we previously with Oklahoma? Because we did the Oklahoma TCU game. We said Oklahoma was going to average 7.3 yards per play, and they ended up averaging 7. So our projection actually sort of anticipated a little more per play production, but we predicted Oklahoma to have 37 points. They ended up with 41. So Oklahoma, was a little bit better yard per play, just a little bit worse scoring, but it's within, we're in a touchdown.
What's interesting about that though? What's interesting about that is it's even closer to the score if you take away the defensive touchdown. So 34 points and 7 yards per play. So that's like right on. Like if you adjust for how much less they got, I think it's right on.
And a little bit of that you can say is sort of patting ourselves in the back, but the reason we really do these models is to talk about what are and are not consistent data points. We like to say, okay, and this is how we were really able to say definitively that first Auburn Georgia game was uncharacteristic because we have our model that is designed to be very, very objective, that we don't introduce any of our own personal constants. It's entirely based off historical data. And we can say, okay, either there was something really weird about this matchup or this team just didn't perform the way it had performed before. Because given these two teams, if you compare the matchups, how they've done against their individual opponents, this doesn't actually make sense. Adjusted for quality of opponent, all that, it's actually very heavily factored in. Oklahoma against TCU was pretty well dead on with exactly what you should expect Oklahoma to do against a defense that resembled TCU's. And that's scary because if you have an offense that's that consistent, again, it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on you because you know that other offense is going to score points. It's a lot like Clemson has been the last 2 years against Alabama in the playoffs, in that it really didn't matter how good Alabama's defense was. You knew Deshaun Watson was going to score. And Georgia is facing a similar situation. But I'm going to turn the coin a little bit because there was one area where our model wasn't very good, and that was in predicting TCU's production. We predicted TCU to have about 6 yards per play. TCU only had 5.2, but we predicted TCU to have almost 30 points. We had 29, and they only actually got 17. So I think what you see is an Oklahoma team that is very consistent offensively, very consistent at scoring points, but can have spurts of very good defensive play. It's gone up or down. Some of it has been the emergence of young corners that have kind of solidified the pass defense. But regardless, in my view, if really, regardless of what happens, Oklahoma is going to put up points. The only question is their defense play at a high or low level, and does Georgia play at a high or low level? But that means sort of in a default scenario, Oklahoma is always going to be in a good position, and that's a real advantage heading into this ball game.
What does it say to you about Oklahoma's ability to score? Because I want to pull in the flip side of this, where an offense's ability to score also sometimes does rely on the defense giving them the ball back. What does it say to you that, first of all, I think it's fair to admit that Big 12 defenses just aren't that good, and there's a lot of SEC defenses this year that aren't very good either. I think on average, Big 12 offenses are a good bit better than SEC offenses, but if you look down the list of who Oklahoma played, defensively, they only played three decent teams, in my opinion. TCU, Texas, and everybody jokes about Texas because they gave it so many points to Maryland, but they've proven to be a pretty decent defensive team. Look at what they did against Oklahoma State and Ohio State. The issue, though, with that is Oklahoma hasn't faced a team that's had both a good offense and a good defense in the same squad to effectively either keep the ball away from them or keep them from scoring. So is there something, if we're throwing a bone to the Georgia side, that was not a pun, I'm sorry y'all, it ended up that way. If we're throwing a bone to the Georgia side, is that one where you look at, okay, well, Georgia's got an offense that's physical enough to keep the ball, keep the clock going, and keep it away from Oklahoma's offense, and on the flip side, they have a defense that can slow them down. And this isn't maybe something that Oklahoma's seen this year.
I think that's a fair point. Now, first, I will say, the Ohio State data point is an important data point because Ohio State is maybe, you can debate how good, but they are a pretty darn good football team on both sides of the ball. But outside that, within the Big 12, I'm really not sure who is that good on either side. TCU ends up in the championship game. If you look at S&P's rankings, which are really probably the only reliable way to look at offensive and defensive rankings, TCU was 43rd offensively and 14th defensively. Not really an elite unit. They were a very good unit defensively, sort of bordering on elite, and honestly a pretty average unit offensively. You look at the only other good team in the Big 12. That was Oklahoma State, 4th offensively, but 70th in S&P defensively. So they haven't really faced a balanced attack outside of Ohio State. And to your point, that Ohio State game, it was something of a dominant win by Oklahoma, but they didn't blow out Ohio State.
Hey, we want to be consistent about Alabama deserving their spot in the playoffs, so it was a huge, dominant, blowout win for Oklahoma over Ohio State. Just had to get that
in. That's true. I mean, the cue all the Urban Meyer pizza eating memes and whatnot. But I think you do have to give some credit to what a balanced attack can do, because we said there's been pressure put on teams. And really, I think, like in the TCU game, TCU's defense, I think, suffered because TCU's offense couldn't keep the ball. And watching that game, TCU's defense really struggled early. It reminded me actually a lot of Auburn beating Alabama, where the defense was struggling to get off the field and was doing just kind of sort of okay. And you felt like they could maybe turn the corner if the offense just got some drives and let the defense catch their breath, but they couldn't do it. Georgia is going to have more balance. And I think one of the big things is Georgia is going to really slow down the game. Assuming they can convert third downs, which in general they have been able to do. Georgia has a style of offense that really shortens ball games. They run the ball an absolute ton, and it sort of wears on teams. And when I say run the ball a ton, one of the things we take into account in our model is run pass balance. And we base it off the first 3 quarters as a crude way of trying to take out garbage time. Georgia is more than 2-to-1 run to pass in the first 3 quarters. So when you're in that situation, I mean, it just really, really shortens the number of possessions you see. And, the more that is shortened, the fewer plays that you end up seeing, then, the harder it is for your defense to have, your offense to have a rhythm, the harder it is for your team to sort of take over. And the way that Oklahoma has frequently been able to sort of pressure teams into a disaster, it gets a lot harder if they're not on the field. And it gets tremendously harder if Georgia's sort of able to keep pace, and all of a sudden Oklahoma's the one that has to come out and has a rapid fire passing attack, you can sort of be thrown off rhythm. So it's hard to say beyond obviously if you're really good on both phases, offense and defense, then you're going to be a better football team. But I do think there's something considerably more to the fact that Oklahoma is a really high power tempo offense. And watching that TCU game where TCU had to go for it on fourth down because they were giving up scores, that's what leads to the blowouts, and that gives an advantage to your team that you might not otherwise have, and it separated themselves more from their opponents. It gave them advantages in time of possession, in play count, which is far more important than time of possession. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen here. At least it shouldn't. And because of that, I think it does help the statistics. The statistics that they gained from being able to sort of outpace and pressure opponents don't necessarily apply, and it makes them look maybe a little bit better than they should against a more
Well,
balanced
since you
team.
mentioned statistics, and we've been trying to get into the computer model sooner rather than later because it creates some interesting talking points, I think. Let's go ahead and get in the data model, the computer model. And I think Oklahoma fans, Georgia fans are well versed on what this model does. So really dive into it. And if any of y'all have any questions on what it does, we just did a video for both of y'all, so you can refer to that one. So dive right into the numbers and let us know what the computer model says.
Sure enough. So our model breaking down the per play averages for teams, Oklahoma does give up right at opponent averages pretty consistently. They give up 100% of opponent averages against the pass, 97% of opponent averages run. This is not an artificial metric. Advanced stats are useful, and sometimes we will reference them, but this is an absolute statistic. If you looked at opponent passing averages, you look at what Oklahoma allows on the season, it's 100% of opponent passing averages. If you look at opponent rush averages, it's 97%, so effectively the same. Georgia defensively is a very good team, but they actually have kind of fallen off late in the season. It's been interesting. They give up 76% of opponent rushing averages, which really anything below 80 is very good, and we generally say below 75 or so with rush defenses is elite. Georgia is a borderline elite rush defense, which is kind of surprising because just a few weeks ago they were pushing into the 60s, and a lot of that is due to the effect of Auburn. But I think we'll sort of touch on what this means later. There's some interesting signs there. And then opponent pass averages, Georgia's giving up 75.6%. That's extremely good. It is much harder to hold a team to below their average passing averages than it is their rush averages. We'll get into this more probably in some of the other games, not sort of rag on certain teams. Ohio State probably explain away a lot of what's happened with Alabama. But if you have a run first team, it's a lot easier to scheme. It's a lot easier to send extra guys in the box and deal with it. If you're facing an elite passer, there are ways that the offense can spread you out, create one-on-one matchups, and essentially scheme someone open consistently. That's why the best NFL teams have almost exclusively gone to passing offenses and often almost abandoned the run. And that's because the run you can stop. The pass, you can have a crappy offensive line and a lot of other problems, but if you got a pretty good passing attack, a good quarterback, and some solid receivers, you can move the football against almost anybody, irrespective of defense. So the fact that Georgia's holding teams to 75% of their opponent passing averages is seriously impressive. And again, that is balanced against quality of the opponents. But one of the interesting things I think was in the Auburn game, the first one, Auburn was able to move the ball through the air, and they weren't able to do it so much in the second. But I do think there's another caveat here. When you play teams that really don't pass the ball very well, and most of Georgia's opponents, and when I say most, I mean virtually all of them outside Auburn, were poor pass offenses. There is a little bit where you can disrupt them and they just kind of shut down. So that sort of affects the metric. But at the same time, it is absolutely elite, borderline dominant to be holding teams to the mid 70s in passing averages. Okay, all that put aside, how does that sort of play out? Well, our model expects Oklahoma to average over 4 yards a carry and 9 yards per attempt. Uh, that's pretty high. And the expected output for Oklahoma in this game is roughly 6.6 yards per play. And sort of put that in perspective, that's what their really the only comparable game is Kansas. It's actually predicting right at their average in the Kansas game. That's not really a good indicator because Kansas could not move the football absolutely whatsoever. It's a little bit less than TCU allowed. It's a little bit less than they managed against Ohio State. So maybe Ohio State offensive production is probably a pretty good indicator of where they should end up. For Georgia, they are expected to still run the ball pretty good clip. I mean, again, right at their opponent averages here. So 5.7 yards per carry, 8.9 yards per attempt. And I think one of the interesting things here, Georgia's expected to have a higher per play average, 6.7 yards per play to 6.6 for Oklahoma. Georgia is expected to be able to pass the ball in a per play sense almost as well as Oklahoma. You're looking at 8.9 yards per pass for Georgia, 9.1 for Oklahoma. The difference being that Georgia's averaging about a yard and a half more per rush. The problem with all of this is that Oklahoma is just really, really good at extending drives and scoring. And a lot of that is Baker Mayfield. And, we haven't really hit on this yet, and I know we'll want to touch on it. I am really freaking high on Baker Mayfield. He's been able to score, and those of the Oklahoma fans that listen to the Oklahoma TCU thing, this was my point. He scores no matter what you do. He's found ways to use, against Ohio State, he relied on the fullback. In some games, he's relied on receivers. Some games, it's been tight ends. And that's the mark of an excellent quarterback because no matter how you scheme, you have to leave somebody open, and he finds the open guy. Because of that, Oklahoma doesn't leave a ton of yardage on the field. They find ways to punch it in consistently, and they score a little bit better off their yardage than Georgia. So even though Georgia is expected to outgain Oklahoma by a small amount, our model predicts Oklahoma to outscore Georgia 35-32.
And I don't think that's crazy. What's really cool about our model at this point in the year is we've got so much of a history on these teams, and it's frustrating early on in the season. And you heard me for a couple 3 weeks complain about how we don't have enough data, so it's really hard to get a good bearing on what these teams are and what they do. Now we have a lot of data, and now we can see, okay, this is who Georgia is, and this is their statistical outlier, the Auburn game. We can look at Oklahoma and say, this is who Oklahoma is, and I think offensively, if we're looking at their statistical outlier, it's Texas. So in all that, when you see a 35-32 score, I'm not super taken aback by that, really. The only thing I wonder about this game is kind of what I talked about before, and this is where I want to talk about a little bit some of the intangibles that don't show up in the stat sheet. We've got two teams who have had the ability offensively to blow out anybody they play, which gives us a lot of garbage data or a lot of slowing down a little bit, not scheming to win the game because they know they can win the game and working on things like a scrimmage. So that's one thing that I'd love for you to talk about. The other thing I'd love for you to talk about is an intangible in Georgia's favor, I think, and that's to be the ability to be physical on the line, offensive and defensive line, and run the ball. And that's not something I think Oklahoma has really seen much this year. So maybe talk about those two things. They're two completely different concepts, but I'd love for you to touch on both of them and how it might favor one team or the other.
I think the first thing to sort of note here is the way Georgia is able to pressure a defense pressure an offense through physicality. Georgia's defensive front has given a lot of people issues just due to the sheer athleticism of it. Guys like Lorenzo Carter, Roquan Smith are pretty dominant. You got Thompson, guys in the middle that are huge. And as much as Oklahoma has been very good throwing the football, they've actually been a really darn good rushing attack. One of the interesting things when you look at the statistics here is that Oklahoma averages 5.6 yards per carry, and Georgia averages 5.85. And I know people realize that Oklahoma is a dominant passing attack, but I think there's a general expectation that Georgia goes into this game with clearly the more dominant running attack. Statistically, that's not really true. In a per play sense, Oklahoma is able to run the ball almost just as well as Georgia. It's just overshadowed because Oklahoma's passing game is so darn good. But I think one of the big things that Oklahoma is going to run into is I don't think they faced a front that is as big as physical against the run. And Georgia can do things where they can attack with run blitzes and get pass disruption and still be able to maintain integrity against the run in ways that I don't think Oklahoma's really had to face yet. And so I don't think anybody's really been able to play them straight up and not do it in a one-dimensional sense. You could attack Oklahoma by really trying to defend the pass, which I think TCU did the first time, and get destroyed by the running back, or you can really attack the run and try to play over the top, which is what I think Ohio State did, and Oklahoma was able to leverage the fullback and a lot of stuff and sort of hit the short to intermediate passing game that Ohio State was giving them. Georgia can actually, I think, play them straight up. We currently questionable whether something is going to happen with Robbie Anderson, which could be a major factor in the game. I'm not sure how big a deal that really is right now, but I think an important thing here is, unlike TCU, Georgia's linebackers can run and they can cover, and you're not going to get a running back in space and just hit easy, huge chunk plays on Georgia. So they don't have to fear so much. And the same way TCU really played back and played against the pass, Georgia can do the same thing and not be completely unsound defensively. Or if they want to play the run, they can challenge a little bit more. Though I think, interestingly, I've talked about their Georgia's numbers in the secondary. I think their passing defense numbers are probably a little bit inflated, frankly. And it kind of goes back to what I'm saying earlier. Because they're able to play straight up, they're often able to generate pressure with 4. And if you're a really good passing attack, they can bring 5 or 6 and not really get totally burned. They can deal with having guys in isolation and they can affect the passing game. And they've been able to do that such that they've been able to cover up what, in my opinion, are corners and safeties that are good in true protection, but I think are a little bit weaker than the front 7. I'm not saying they're bad, but the numbers suggest Georgia is an elite pass defense. And I think really Georgia and Clemson both, I think they're an elite pass defense in general, but I think what you really have is an elite pass rush defense. They have an elite disruptive front 7, and they have a secondary that's good enough to be consistent in coverage. But I think if you put their secondary on another team that didn't have this front 7, they would actually end up looking fairly average. So, how does that all kind of relate? Well, I think it basically comes down to the fact that Georgia is going to be able to play things more straight up and bring blitzes and not be unsound in ways that Oklahoma's other opponents have been. And Mayfield is a very good quarterback, and he can create and he can find the open guy. But again, going back to the NFL example, even very good quarterbacks really struggle if, 1, they're pressured, and 2, there is no clearly open guy. It goes back to the Peyton Manning getting swallowed up by Von Miller. Even very, very good quarterbacks can struggle in some of those situations, and it will be interesting, I think, to see how Oklahoma responds to it. Now you're going to have to remind me of the second part of your question because I've already forgotten.
So the other part of the question was just how much does it skew the data if we're looking at two teams who have both had the ability to blow out most of their schedule? So each team treats a blowout game differently. Some want to run it up, some want to get people experience, and some want to work on with their starters stuff and treat it like a scrimmage. So are these two teams so good relative to the competition that they faced that it puts a big old question mark on our computer model?
I think in some instances it does cause issues. We talked about early in the season with Alabama, our computer model was really under predicting Alabama. And the reason for that was when they would get up really consistently, they were up by 30 points by the start of the second half. And they would pull all the defensive starters, and their defensive statistics looked good, not necessarily elite, but good. And it was extremely deceptive because they didn't allow a darn thing for a half, put in the backups, and gave up, I think it was like 17 points to Fresno State. It ended up being a pretty good team. The issue with Oklahoma and Georgia, one, I don't think either one of these teams has been in a position to put teams away just quite so completely. In Oklahoma's case, the defense oddly hasn't been good enough to make themselves look bad. And when I say that, I mean, their opponents generally have been able to score throughout the game, and with the exception of teams that were really, really bad, you ended up with scores like 38-20 TCU in the first matchup. Was it a blowout? Yes. But at an 18-point game, Oklahoma couldn't afford to start the second string for the entire fourth quarter. And that's been the way it has been for Oklahoma for most of the season. In Georgia's case, it's a little bit different, but one, their schedule was weak enough that when they put in their backups, a lot of times the other team's going to put in their backups because it was in conference play. The SEC East is quite bad this year, and the
This
backups
year.
in okay, well, yeah, okay, it's been most years recently, but I feel like honestly, I feel like it's especially bad this year. I mean, it is kind of at a different level, and I think the backups to the other teams have been worse than the starters. But a big deal for Georgia, they're extremely deep at the running back position, and they are, as we said, a more than exceptionally run first offense. So, considering they were only throwing 14 passes anyway, when they get in those situations and they just run the ball, I almost think it inflates their numbers sometimes because they were already going to run the ball almost every play. The other team can't stop it. Now they get worn out. The other team starts rotating, and Auburn's depth at tailback is able to take over. It's a real similar thing. Again, we're drawing a lot of comparisons to Alabama because I think they're fair comparisons to where Georgia's at this year. We talked about the past couple years. We've predicted some huge blowouts from Alabama, and our answer has been, why? Well, how did you predict they do that, or why would you think they'd blow out Tennessee by 40 points? It's like, well, they can't really stop scoring. I think it was last year, Alabama, got up by 20 or 30 points and started putting in their fourth, fifth string guy, and oh look, this Bo Scarborough kid's coming in, and then he breaks off an 80-yard touchdown run. Georgia has the same sort of depth at tailback. And when you've got guys like Georgia has, and you put in your third string guy, and your third string guy is Swift, who would start for most teams, it's helped their statistics. And so I don't think their statistics are actually hampered that much, simply because their depth has been so good that they continue to score at a very high level and they continue to move the ball at a very high level, even when they start rotating guys out.
All right. So one more thing for me to ask you, and then I'll ask you about your gut score, and we'll wrap it up. But um, last year and the year before, I really think Alabama suffered in that they were the one seed, or however the seeds fell, that they played Clemson second. So they had a month to prepare for a team that they could blow out without preparing at all. So Michigan State and Washington offensively just didn't really pose much of a threat. And I think they would have benefited a lot had they been able to prepare for Deshaun Watson and that Clemson offense for a month instead of for a week. So did Georgia in this case get a much better draw because they have a month to prepare for Oklahoma? And if they do win, they're going to prepare for an offense that's a little more familiar to what that's in their comfort zone, or does it not matter at all?
I think it does help Georgia, and I kind of have to go back and forth on this in my head, but I think Oklahoma's offense is a lot more interesting, sophisticated, complicated than Georgia's. Georgia's offense right now is pretty straightforward and simple. But the flip side to that is if you had a week to prepare, it's a challenge to prepare for everything that Oklahoma throws in front of you. But I think you can kind of grasp a lot of what Georgia has. And while with a month to prepare, Oklahoma is going to really have a lot of stuff exceptionally well scouted and be able to read and react really well. I think it helps Georgia more because Georgia has time to be familiar with everything Oklahoma does. And if they were in a normal game, by about halfway through the game, you're just kind of playing on instinct and you have to back off on the complications of your defensive scheme. And Kirby Smart loves to have a complicated defense. And as we saw with his time in Alabama and his time in the first Auburn game, sometimes it's overly complicated and they can't react because there's so many checks and they get overwhelmed and they know it's like someone that takes a test 2 days before they're ready for it and they try to cram the day before, but they weren't quite there yet. And they get in and just kind of have a panic attack. When you have a full month, now everybody can really get all their answers down straight. And everything they see, they already know what the answer is. They can adjust really well. I don't expect Oklahoma's going to do anything completely new because what they've done's worked so well. So I do think it ends up helping Georgia more, just because in a normal time span is not a ton of time to prepare for this Oklahoma offense. But given a month, they're actually going to be in a pretty good situation in terms of knowing what they need to do to succeed.
All right, so having talked this thing to death, why don't you give me your gut score? Remind everybody what the computer model score was and give me your gut score.
So the computer model has it Oklahoma 35, Georgia 32. I don't necessarily think that's all that far off. And if you look at where Georgia and Oklahoma have been all season, I think it's, as we said, it's very reasonable to expect Oklahoma to score in the 30s. And the expectation should be that Georgia ends up with something around their average, their scoring average, which is 34 points a game. So for the first time all year, my gut is to pick against Georgia. I've picked them every game all season, but the reality is this Oklahoma team is really, really good. And more importantly, I think their quarterback is really good. We saw Oklahoma kind of stumble several years ago against Florida with Sam Bradford. I honestly think Mayfield is a much better quarterback in these situations because he's a lot more creative. I don't think Bradford really responded well to the pressure. And I think really just Mayfield has an ability to create against anybody that it utterly impresses me. So I'm going to go with, I'm going to say Oklahoma 34, Georgia 31, pretty close to the score prediction. I do think this game could go absolutely either way. And to the extent I'm picking Oklahoma, I'm saying I'm saying 60%, maybe 55-45, 60-40 chance Oklahoma wins. I think this should be an extremely competitive game. I think it could go a lot of different ways. If either one of these teams doesn't show up playing well, they're going to lose. And I think if they both show up playing well, you're going to end up with something that is kind of a shootout and sort of a last position game. It favors Oklahoma slightly, but as we talk about all the time, if you got a score that you think is going to be within 7 points, you're talking about the way one ball, on one fumble bounces and who recovers that being who wins the game. And I do think this is that sort of game, but I do give the edge slightly to Oklahoma.
All right, so the model's got 35-32. That's not crazy. I'm not taken aback by that. You're picking Oklahoma close. I don't think that's crazy either. That's right in line with what Vegas is saying. I think, though, that a lot of the wider narrative in the public and not necessarily the betting narrative is that Oklahoma's coming in super hot and they're kind of unbeatable. And I think there's some truth to that, but I also think the matchup isn't great for Oklahoma. And I'm going to take something you said a couple of weeks ago and I'm going to turn it against you and use it against you for your pick here. I asked you what you thought in the Iron Bowl, if both teams got going and both teams were scoring like crazy and neither defense was able to get the other off the field, which team would you go with? And you said, historically, you like to go with the team that's more disruptive and disruptive on defense and not necessarily the most consistent team on defense or the best team on defense, but the most disruptive, the one that's got the front seven that can get after the quarterback, that can force the turnovers, the quick change situations, maybe get some sacks and steal a possession away from an offense. And in this case, I think that's Georgia. I think Oklahoma's defense is better than they get credit for, although I am worried about that Kansas State game a little bit. 35 to them is inexcusable because it's a terrible offense. But I do think that in this case, Georgia is a better defense, although not a better offense. They are a better defense, and they are a more disruptive defense, which means I think that defense and their ability to maybe get a turnover or a short field for their offense is going to be the difference in the game. Give me the model score 35-32 in reverse. I'll take Georgia 35, Oklahoma 32. And based on your pick, I don't think you're going to call me crazy, but here's your opportunity. Am I crazy?
Right. Interesting. And I can't disagree with that. And I think it's going to be interesting because you have on one end a very disruptive Georgia defense. And I've already seen various places people talking about Alabama's defense in 2013 and what they were able to do. And, Auburn last year. Georgia is very different defensively than those two teams. Both those two teams were solid, but they were not overly disruptive. Alabama in 2013 were actually both very critical of because they had some real issues with an inability to generate pressure and disruption. And then last year's Auburn team was very good in the front four, but they were really, honestly, an excellent run stopping unit and then just very sound everywhere else. Georgia is almost the polar opposite of it. They are a disruptive team, and they are very athletic more than they are big and physical in some ways. But on the other hand, Baker Mayfield, I've said before that if you give me a really high scoring game or a close game, most of the time I'll pick the team that runs the ball better. The one time that I sort of have an exception to that is if you have an exceptional quarterback in a short passing game, because it is just brutally difficult to stop, as we saw with Deshaun Watson. And you've got good on good here. I think it's an excellent matchup. I don't really have confidence one way or the other that it'll turn out, but I think any fan that feels like their team is going to be the dominant one to win this game is wrong. And I think if this game ends up being lopsided, you should sort of, take a step back and sort of catch your breath because you got kind of lucky the other team didn't show up.
All right, that's going to wrap it up for us, Oklahoma and Georgia. You guys know the drill. Give us in the comments your MVP, give us your score predictions. And, you feel free to mix it up there. Just back up your positions with data. We're a data-driven channel, and we don't like to read or respond to nonsense. So also remember, if you like it, give us a like. If you love it, we'd love a thumbs up and a subscribe. But remember, you can also downvote us. We're okay with that. Just back up why you hated us or what we did wrong. So anyway, thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.